History remembers wars and kings, but not the sound of starving mouths. Between 1315 and 1322, Europe descended into a silence far darker than battle, the silence of famine. It was not a plague, nor a sword that killed millions, but the collapse of nature itself. Crops drowned, grain rotted, and hope decayed with it. When every field turned to mud and every prayer returned unanswered, humanity discovered its final boundary and crossed it. This is the story of when hunger devoured the human soul, and dinner tables became graves. In the spring of 1315, the skies above Europe betrayed their people. For weeks, rain poured without mercy, swelling rivers into monsters that swallowed farmland whole. Wheat, barley, and rye, the veins of survival, rotted black in their fields. Villagers who once counted their days by the harvest now counted them by the graves. The air stank of damp soil and hopelessness. In England, France, and the Low Countries, the same story unfolded. Granaries emptied, livestock drowned, and stores of salt spoiled. There was no bread, no ale, and soon no dignity. Chroniclers of the time wrote of the tears of God, but the starving did not believe in divine sorrow. To them, heaven had gone silent. The first to die were the poor. Peasants clawed at frozen ground, searching for roots and worms. Families boiled nettles and moss to feed their children, while the wealthy retreated into guarded halls. Yet no wall could hold out hunger for long. Servants disappeared, and nobles began to look upon one another with quiet calculation. In Flanders, records tell of a mother who buried her last child beneath a willow tree, then returned days later to dig again. When a friar found her weeping beside an empty pit, she could only whisper that her child was no longer cold. It was not cruelty, it was the breaking of the mind under hunger's weight. Every corner of Europe bore witness. Fishermen fought over rotting eels in the rivers. Markets became scenes of violence as traders sold scraps at the price of gold. The smell of death clung to everything, the breath of beasts, the wet timber of houses, even the church pews where the dying sought absolution. By winter, desperation transformed into something unspoken. Graves were robbed under moonlight. Shepherds vanished, leaving behind half-eaten remnants that wolves did not claim. Rumors began to spread, rumors that the starving were feeding not only on beasts but on one another. No one wanted to believe it, yet everyone knew someone who whispered it. In the Abbey of St. Albans, a monk recorded a confession that chilled his ink. The famine has stolen the image of God from men. They eat the flesh of their kin, and yet they still pray. The church urged the people to fast, not realizing that they already had nothing to eat. Faith was stretched thin, torn between sin and survival. As the reign continued, Europe began to rot, not just in body but in spirit. The landscape itself seemed diseased, fields reduced to blackened mud, forests stripped bare of bark. Travelers avoided villages, fearing disease, but mostly fearing what they might find simmering over a dying fire. By 1316, entire regions were ghosted, hamlets silent, roads littered with abandoned carts, skeletons lying beside them like discarded tools. The famine had no armies, no generals, no banners, yet it conquered more souls than any war. And somewhere in the darkness of a forgotten village, a fire burned beneath an iron pot. Inside it, something was cooking that was not meant to be eaten. The world was about to learn what happens when bread turns to bone. The famine did not stop at borders. It crept like a living shadow, seeping from village to village, until all of Europe felt its slow suffocation. By the winter of 1316, kingdoms that once stood proud under banners of gold were reduced to hollow thrones and hungry streets. The rain never ceased, and neither did the dying. In France, King Philip V issued decrees to restrict the hoarding of grain. Yet his own storehouses overflowed with guarded sacks while peasants collapsed in the gutters outside. Paris, the people whispered that their king was not a ruler but a jailer of bread. Priests pleaded for divine mercy, but their sermons fell on the deaf ears of those who could no longer believe that God had not turned his face away. Across the Holy Roman Empire, the misery was the same. Rivers ran thick with the bodies of livestock drowned in floods. The smell of rot rolled across the fields like fog, settling over towns that now echoed only with the sounds of coughing and crying. Chroniclers described mothers gnawing on bark, fathers offering their labor for a single crust, and nobles sending armed men to steal what remained of the harvest from the dying. Starvation does not respect lineage. In Bavaria, the duke's youngest son perished, not in battle, but from hunger. The court doctors could do nothing but watch his body thin into transparency. It was said the duke ordered his child buried without ceremony, afraid that showing weakness would invite rebellion. But rebellion came anyway. The starving have no loyalty when their bellies are empty. Across the Channel, England fared no better. The harvests failed again, and the king's officials seized grain to feed the armies rather than the people. Crowds gathered outside London, shouting for bread, until soldiers cut them down in the mud. Chroniclers would later note that the blood mixed so thickly with the rain that the streets turned crimson for days. Then came the disappearances. Villages that had once sent tax to their lords simply vanished. Travelers spoke of entering towns where doors hung open, tables were overturned, and fires still smoldered, but no voices remained. The fields were littered with bones, stripped clean. Wolves had not done this. Their tracks were absent. It was something far more deliberate. In the records of Hildesheim, one scribe wrote a single sentence before he died: "The people are eating the people." No name, no date, just a truth too heavy for ink to carry. The famine had devoured more than flesh. It had consumed trust, order, faith. Merchants stopped trading, fearing ambush. Roads emptied, cities stank of death. Even the clergy faltered, for how could they preach hope to those who had seen children roasted in desperation? The world itself seemed cursed, as though the soil had turned against the species that fed upon it. By the time the rains slowed, Europe was no longer a continent of empires, but of graves. The great cathedrals stood untouched, yet their pews were filled with corpses awaiting burial. Between France and Germany, only silence ruled the land. The silence of an empire devoured not by war, but by its own hunger. And in that silence, the next horror began to take root, in a forgotten village near the Rhine, where the eyes of the living had begun to resemble those of the dead. By the spring of 1317, the famine had reduced Europe to a map of silent graves. Along the Rhine, where the river once glittered with merchant boats, only scavenger birds now drifted. And in one of its many forgotten bends lay a nameless hamlet, a cluster of sagging roofs surrounded by black water and sunken fields. Chroniclers would later call it the village of the hollow eyes. No messenger had reached it in months. The road that once led to the nearest abbey was washed away by flood and decay. The villagers were trapped, surrounded by mud, hunger, and the memory of food. By winter, they had eaten everything that could be eaten: dogs, cats, bark, even boiled leather torn from old boots. When those were gone, only the dead remained. A priest named Father Anselm kept a small journal, perhaps to preserve what little faith he still had. In his early entries, he wrote prayers for rain to stop, for light to return, for his parishioners to endure. But by midwinter, his words darkened. He began to write of screams at night, of doors forced open, of bones discovered near the hearths of families too weak to bury their own. One evening, Anselm wrote of a young mother, Clara, whose 2 children had perished. When he went to bless the bodies, he found only empty sheets and a boiling pot. Clara sat motionless by the fire, eyes hollow, her voice faint. "They would not suffer long," she whispered, "and now I may see them again in peace." The priest fled, but he did not condemn her, for he too had begun to starve. As the months passed, the living made bargains with sin. The strong waited for the weak to die. The weak prayed for death. The smell of cooking returned to the village, faint but unmistakable, and no one asked what it meant. Hunger had stripped away shame as surely as it had stripped flesh from bone. In one of his final entries, Father Anselm described a gathering beneath the church. The villagers, skeletal and trembling, stood around the altar. Upon it lay a corpse, a man who had died the night before, his face covered with a shroud. They spoke no words, offered no prayers. One by one, they began to cut. Anselm wrote that he tried to stop them, but his legs gave out, and when the knife passed to him, he did not refuse. After that night, the journal changed. His handwriting grew frantic, his sentences shorter, ending mid-thought. He no longer prayed to God but begged forgiveness from those whose flesh sustained me. The final page was a single sentence written in shaking ink. The feast is finished. And so are we. Years later, a traveler passing through the region found the ruins of the church half buried in mud. Inside, bones were scattered like spilled grain, many showing signs of fire. Among them lay a rusted crucifix and a single damp-stained journal. The first pages had long since dissolved, but the last still clung to life, whispering the memory of a hunger that turned saints into beasts. Thus the story of the village of the hollow eyes entered history, not as a legend, but as a warning of what humanity becomes when the soul is eaten before the flesh. While nameless villages perished in silence, the halls of kings echoed with whispers of guilt. In England, the famine had struck with merciless precision, flooding the fields, killing the harvest, and driving prices beyond reach. By 1317, the granaries of the realm were guarded more fiercely than its borders. In this chaos sat Edward II, a monarch adrift in his own kingdom. The king's court was restless. Nobles muttered of revolt. Merchants begged for trade relief. Yet in Westminster, banquets continued. Chroniclers record that the king dined behind locked doors, while the city outside sank into filth and hunger. Prisoners vanished from the Tower. Servants were dismissed without warning, and the royal kitchen smoked at all hours. Rumors slithered through London's narrow streets that the royal table remained full only because it had changed its source of meat. No one dared speak it aloud near soldiers, but in the taverns, whispers carried, "The king eats as we rot." Edward's reign had already been marked by scandal and political weakness. Now famine deepened the hatred. Peasants who once bowed now spat upon the sight of royal banners. The markets were empty, the rivers polluted with dead cattle, and beggars lined the palace gates. Chroniclers described them clawing at the iron bars, calling the king's name in desperation until soldiers drove them back with clubs. Inside, courtiers lived in uneasy luxury. They spoke of missing servants, of strange deliveries brought to the kitchens at night. The royal cook, a man named Geoffrey of Hereford, was said to have confessed to a priest before vanishing. His last words reportedly, "The meat I serve has no name." Whether truth or rumor, it was enough to chill even those closest to power. Foreign emissaries who visited England during the famine wrote of a kingdom drowning in contradiction, a starving people ruled by a court that feasted behind curtains. One French observer noted that England is a graveyard and its king dines in mourning. Yet Edward seemed untouched, lost in the illusion that his crown could shield him from the decay around him. In the countryside, revolt simmered. Men abandoned their lords' estates, choosing the forests over famine. Thieves raided storehouses and women tore open grain carts with bare hands. When the king's sheriffs retaliated, they found themselves outnumbered by the starving. In York, mobs dragged officials into the streets and hanged them beside empty market stalls. Chroniclers claimed that when news of these uprisings reached the king, he gave no response. He continued to dine in silence, flanked by guards who would not meet his eyes. Those who served him said he had grown pale and thin, haunted by unseen guilt. One report, never proven, described a servant discovering the king alone at his table, staring at an untouched plate, muttering, "It tastes of ash." By 1318, the famine began to loosen its grip. The rain slowed, crops revived, and the people crawled back from the brink. But the scars remained, not just in the fields, but in the memory of the nation. Years later, when Edward was deposed and imprisoned, the peasants whispered that it was not politics that dethroned him, but the curse of the feast, a divine punishment for a king who died while his people devoured one another. The crown had survived the storm, but its shine was forever tainted by the silence that reigned at the king's table. By the year 1319, the famine had changed shape. What began as starvation had become a market. Hunger no longer killed in silence. It bargained in whispers, traded in shadows. Across Europe, the economy of despair was born, an underground commerce where the price of survival was measured not in gold, but in flesh. In small towns of Flanders and Burgundy, night markets appeared like sicknesses that could not be cured. They did not advertise, yet everyone knew where to find them. Under the cover of darkness, cloaked figures exchanged sacks of meat wrapped in coarse linen. Some called it wolf meat, others black pork. But the buyers knew. They always knew. A chronicler from Ghent wrote of these trades in trembling Latin. Men sell the flesh of their kind as if it were the flesh of beasts. The buyers ask no questions, and the sellers offer no prayers. It was said that a strong man's thigh could fetch more than a barrel of grain, and the flesh of children was prized for its tenderness. Authorities tried to intervene, but famine had already devoured justice. In Bruges, the city guard raided a cellar after reports of strange odors. Inside, they found 2 butchers and a woman boiling what they called lost travelers. The guards arrested them, but by dawn, one of the watchmen had stolen the remains for his own family. The others said nothing. Everyone was guilty. The church attempted to impose order. Bishops preached that consuming human flesh was a sin beyond forgiveness, but even their sermons rang hollow. Many of those who condemned it had tasted it. Priests starved like the peasants they preached to. In one account from Artois, a bishop reportedly paid a group of grave robbers to bring him what God had abandoned. As famine deepened, people stopped pretending. In some towns, open meat markets emerged, not sanctioned, but tolerated. Mothers who lost their children sold what they could not bury. Thieves murdered travelers and passed off the spoils as livestock. In the dark corners of inns, meat pies became a symbol of suspicion. A man could not eat without wondering what or who was in his bowl. The trade grew boldest near the German border, where war and famine met like old companions. Soldiers accustomed to killing found profit in their habits. They hunted deserters and peasants alike, stripping bodies and salting the flesh for sale. Chroniclers called them flesh merchants, but among themselves, they were known as Die Grauen Metzger, the Grey Butchers. Even after the worst years passed, the evidence of the trade lingered. Bones were discovered in barrels meant for grain, buried beneath taverns, hidden in the walls of bakeries. A few were taken to trial, though most trials ended quickly. How could a judge sentence a man for doing what the judge himself had done to survive? In one surviving court record from Arras, a woman named Marguerite confessed to selling her husband's body after his death. When asked why, she answered simply, "Because no one would buy mine." She was executed by hanging, though many in the crowd pitied her more than they condemned. By the time the famine's shadow began to lift, humanity had learned a truth too shameful to speak, that hunger is stronger than law, stronger than faith, stronger even than love. And when the first fields began to bloom again, people cheered the return of bread, but the smell of it brought no comfort. It reminded them of what bread had once replaced. The famine had ended, but the markets of the night had shown the world its reflection, a world willing to feed upon itself, so long as the price was survival. Long before the famine of Europe, another hunger had already scarred the soul of Christendom. It began not with drought or pestilence, but with faith. The year was 1098, during the First Crusade. The city of Marah, in present-day Syria, stood defiant beneath its walls, unaware that the starving armies outside were about to commit one of history's darkest acts. The Crusaders had marched thousands of miles from Europe, driven by the promise of salvation and the greed of conquest. Yet, by the time they reached Marah, salvation had grown hollow. The roads behind them were littered with corpses, pilgrims, deserters, and beasts alike. Supplies had rotted, the winter was harsh, and even the noblest knights had begun to eat whatever they could find. For weeks they besieged the city. Arrows darkened the sky, and the moans of the dying became a nightly chorus. Inside Marah, the citizens starved as well. It was a contest of desperation, one that would end not in victory, but in horror. On December 12th, the Crusaders breached the gates. What followed was not battle, but slaughter. Chroniclers wrote that the streets ran like a river of blood. Those who resisted were cut down. Those who fled were hunted house by house. But when the killing stopped, the Crusaders found nothing worth taking. No food, no grain. Only bodies, thousands of them, silent and still. And so the hunger returned. At first, they roasted the corpses of their enemies in secret. A few soldiers claimed they had found Saracen cattle, but the smell betrayed the lie. Others began to boil flesh in helmets, mixing it with herbs stolen from the city's gardens. The chronicler Radulf of Cannes wrote, "In Marah, our men ate the flesh of the Saracens. Some cut it into pieces, others devoured it raw. It was done from necessity, not cruelty. Necessity, the word that forgave all sins." Soon, entire camps participated. Fires burned day and night, and the scent of cooked flesh drifted across the ruined city. Witnesses described soldiers laughing as they gnawed bones, making mockery of prayer before they feasted. One knight, horrified, wrote to his lord, "I saw with mine own eyes Christians devour men as if they were oxen." Yet for every soldier who recoiled, another justified it as divine irony that the unbelievers, who had denied Christ's body, would now sustain his followers with their own. Priests gave quiet blessings over the fires. Faith twisted itself to fit the hunger. When the papal legates heard of what had happened, they ordered silence. The massacre was recorded in whispers, buried in margins of manuscripts, erased from official chronicles. But rumors spread faster than scripture. Even among fellow crusaders, the men of Marah were spoken of as cursed, not heroes, but cannibals. Muslim historians preserve their side of the memory, sharper and more damning. One wrote, "They killed more than 100,000 of us, and they cooked our flesh, and they called it mercy." The wound left by Marah never healed. It became a scar across both faiths, a reminder that belief can sanctify even the unthinkable. Centuries later, when famine struck Europe, chroniclers would recall Marah as a grim prophecy, proof that hunger had no borders, no creeds. Whether in a starving village or a holy war, the outcome was the same: man consuming man. The siege ended in victory, but it was a victory that tasted like ash. The Crusaders moved on, leaving behind a city of bones and a legacy of shame. Some said the soil itself turned bitter where they had eaten, that crops refused to grow for generations. And though the chronicles of popes and kings would try to forget, Marah remained, a whisper in every hunger that came after, a shadow behind every holy banner raised in the name of salvation. Because the hunger that began there was not just for food, it was for justification. And that hunger, unlike the famine, would never end. There are stories that history tries to forget, because remembering them feels like a sin. Among these are the tales of the starving mothers whispered across Ireland, the Baltic North, and the far edges of Christendom during the Great Famine. They were women once praised for piety and endurance. Yet when hunger came, those virtues turned to ghosts. The year was 1316. The rain had not stopped for 3 years. Crops rotted before harvest, animals drowned in their pens, and the wind carried the stench of decay. In the small villages of Connaught and Ulster, entire families perished before the eyes of mothers who could do nothing but hold them as they faded. Chroniclers rarely wrote their names. Women were not meant to be remembered. But through fragments of confessions, church records, and the fearful gossip of monks, their presence lingers. One parchment from Kilmacduagh Abbey tells of a mother who did boil her babe in milk and wept as she ate, saying, "Better I take him into me than see him taken by the mud." It is easy, from the safety of centuries, to call her monstrous. Harder to understand that she lived in a world where the earth itself had betrayed its people. Fields once green had turned to marsh. Grain sprouted fungus. Bread grew black. Milk soured before sunrise. Priests preached endurance, nobles hoarded grain, and still the children died. Some mothers buried their infants alive, not in cruelty, but mercy. Others traded the flesh of the dead to buy bread for the living. There were even whispers of a covenant among the women of a famine-struck parish near Derry. Each would give one child to save the rest. None could say if it was true, but when travelers passed through months later, they found 12 empty cradles and a silence that no church bell could break. In the Baltic lands, it was no different. The forests of Livonia and Estonia hid their own sorrows. Peasants there told of the snow wives, mothers who wandered the frozen woods with bundles in their arms, singing lullabies to children long dead. The sound of their songs, it was said, could make even the wolves pause. The church called these women cursed, possessed by the devil, yet in their desperation, they had only done what hunger demanded. "She sinned to save her soul," one friar wrote, "and I cannot say which sin was greater, to eat her child or to let him starve." In truth, their guilt became a weapon. Officials found it easier to condemn than to feed. When famine loosened its grip, the surviving mothers were marked. Some were executed, others exiled. And yet the same lords who sentenced them had dined on human flesh themselves, disguised as black bread, purchased from the shadow markets. The hypocrisy of the age was as thick as its mud. Centuries later, folklore would soften their story. Painters and poets turned them into phantoms, ghostly figures haunting the fields they once tilled, reminders of nature's cruelty and human frailty. The Irish called them Maithricha Gorda, the Hunger Mothers. They appeared in misty dawns, veiled in rags, carrying invisible infants in their arms. Those who heard their cries were said to suffer famine again within the year. But beyond myth lies truth. These women were not demons. They were witnesses to a world that stripped them of choice. Their hunger was not only for food, but for mercy, a mercy that never came. And so, the story of the mothers endured, hidden in confessionals, whispered over dying fires. Their faces lost to time, their acts condemned, but their pain eternal. Because in every famine, there comes a moment when love becomes indistinguishable from horror. And in that moment, a mother's heart, once made for nurture, becomes the last meal of a dying world. In 1321, after years of relentless rain and failed harvests, the famine had returned to France with a vengeance. Fields that had once produced grain now stood as marshes of mud, rotting crops, and drowned livestock. Villagers fled to towns, monasteries, and abbeys, seeking shelter and food. But some religious houses, sealed to the outside world, became tombs rather than sanctuaries. One such monastery, situated on the outskirts of the Loire Valley, was discovered by a wandering traveler months after its gates had been bolted. He found the main entrance forced open, hinges rusted and rotted, revealing a scene that would haunt him until his death. Inside, the stone hall was silent except for the faint whistle of wind through broken windows. The stench of decay hung like incense over the long tables. Around the central hall, the monks sat frozen in their final posture. Their robes, once white and symbolizing purity, were now stiff with dust and mildew. their bodies skeletal and contorted, clutched at utensils that had long since corroded. On the table before them lay piles of bones, fragments of ribs, skulls, and limbs, evidence of a ritualistic consumption of their own brethren. Chroniclers later attempted to rationalize the scene. Some called it madness born of starvation. Others, more damning, claimed it was a perverse act of faith, a grotesque echo of communion. The monastery's ledger, partially intact, recorded the deaths of brothers by disease and hunger, and a final entry noted, "The feast shall sustain the body, if not the soul," whether a blessing or a curse. The words proved the line between piety and depravity had vanished. Outside the monastery, the village below had long abandoned hope. Witnesses later described the smell that reached them as unbearable, a mixture of rot, smoke, and human decay. Some say a few villagers had noticed the smoke from chimneys, even though no fires were allowed, and speculated in hushed tones what the monks might be consuming to survive. Few dared investigate while alive. The traveler who entered the monastery documented what he saw with trembling hands. He described the meticulous arrangement of bones, as if the monks had staged the scene in reverence or ritual. In the kitchen, utensils were stacked neatly beside empty cauldrons. Perhaps they had maintained a pretense of ritual until their last breaths, conducting what would become a feast neither holy nor profane, simply human survival pushed to its most grotesque extreme. Historians suggest that this was not an isolated incident. Throughout France, Italy, and the Low Countries, monasteries sometimes served as last bastions of starvation. Sealed and isolated, monks might have succumbed not only to hunger, but to desperation that blurred faith and morality. They had trained themselves to resist temptation, yet hunger had eroded all discipline. The banquet of the damned became a metaphor for the age, a period in which hunger transformed devotion into atrocity. It demonstrated that even men who devoted their lives to God were not immune to the same instincts that drove peasants to steal, soldiers to consume, and mothers to sacrifice their children. When the traveler returned to his village, he did not speak of what he had seen for years. Fear, shame, and disbelief prevented anyone from believing him. Only after his death were fragments of his notes discovered in a monastery ledger far from Loire, describing the skeletal monks, the arranged bones, and the haunting emptiness of their final communion. The banquet of the damned was not merely an act of hunger. It was a mirror, reflecting a truth that would echo across centuries. When famine rules, even sanctity can become a spectacle of horror, and devotion may be paid with flesh. When the rains finally slowed in the 1320s, Europe began to emerge from famine, but the memories of hunger remained embedded in its villages, towns, and monasteries. The church and crown, desperate to restore order, sought to erase every trace of the horrors that had unfolded, the Black Feast that had spread like a silent plague across the continent. Edicts were burned, chronicles suppressed, and graves hidden beneath layers of earth. But the truth, like blood beneath skin, could not be completely hidden. Priests and monks who survived the famine carried secrets heavier than any chalice. In remote corners, they had fed the starving with what they called holy bread, human flesh disguised as sacrament, offering it to the desperate as sustenance and absolution. Confessions written in trembling ink reveal the terror in their own hearts. Men who had devoted their lives to God found themselves complicit in acts that violated every tenet of faith. One friar of Burgundy wrote, "We fed their bodies to preserve their souls. Yet I fear neither God nor man will forgive what we have done." The black market of flesh, once confined to towns, had infiltrated sacred halls. In monasteries, prisoners, beggars, and even the newly deceased were consumed quietly, their bones burned in hearths to hide the evidence. The monks told themselves it was survival, a penance imposed by God himself, but their hearts were hollow and prayers could not fill them. Those who refused to participate often starved beside those they had once guided, silent witnesses to horror. Church authorities issued proclamations denouncing cannibalism and punishing the guilty. Yet enforcement was near impossible. Many guards and clerics had tasted the same flesh. Secrecy was their shield. One record from Rouen describes a bishop who attempted to excommunicate a monk, but found himself unable to condemn him openly, fearing the truth of his own deeds might emerge. Moral authority had decayed faster than the bodies in the fields. Chroniclers who survived the famine recorded fragments of this blasphemy, though carefully veiled. Some suggested that the clergy had become instruments of the famine itself, turning faith into a mechanism of survival. The line between salvation and sin blurred. In confessional parchments from northern France, one priest wrote, "We offered the body of man as bread." The people prayed with mouths full, unaware that God's mercy had taken a darker form. The surviving population, for its part, was caught in a spiral of guilt and forgetfulness. Villagers who had once eaten human flesh for survival could not speak of it without shame. Families preserved silence over dinner tables, hiding memories behind soup and stale bread. Over time, stories were whispered only in private, growing into fragmented legends of the Black Feast, which would haunt the imagination of generations. Even kings intervened, destroying documents and suppressing witnesses. Royal proclamations forbade the recording of crimes born of hunger, and entire town ledgers were incinerated. Yet some confessions escaped destruction. Fragments of diaries, hidden notes in missals, or scribbled accounts passed down secretly. These records reveal that the famine had turned faith into complicity, that devotion could justify atrocities, and that survival often required the transgression of every moral law. The Black Feast, then, was not merely a series of isolated crimes. It was a systemic collapse of ethics and spirituality under the pressure of starvation. Hunger had become a sacrament, and sin had become a tool for salvation. Those who survived carried its shame, passing down its memory like a shadow that never fully left. And centuries later, when historians attempted to piece together the events, they found that flesh and faith were inseparable in the darkest corners of Europe, a grim testament to what humanity might endure, and what humanity might become when survival eclipses conscience. When the rains finally ceased and the earth began to heal, Europe emerged from the famine as a continent scarred, hollowed, and haunted. Fields that had once been black with rot slowly yielded green shoots. Rivers cleared from the sludge of drowned livestock. Villagers returned to their homes, repaired their roofs, and planted what remained of their seeds. Yet beneath this fragile revival, a hunger lingered, one that was not sated by grain or fruit, one that had been born in the darkest hours of desperation. The Black Feast had ended only in appearance. Bones still lay buried beneath soil that had once been trampled into mud by starving feet. Forgotten crypts contained fragments of those consumed, and the earth itself remembered the acts of survival too terrible to name. Memory was the true grave, and the living carried its weight. The famine had shown that humanity's most monstrous hunger was not only for sustenance, but for power, for control, for dominance over life itself. Families whispered of lost children, vanished neighbors, and mothers who had sacrificed their own flesh to prolong life. Priests spoke of sins no absolution could erase. Kings and nobles carried the shame of courts that had dined in safety while peasants starved. Even those who had survived through cannibalism bore a private terror. Every bite consumed a piece of humanity that could never be restored. Across villages, silence spoke louder than any sermon. The marketplaces once filled with desperate trade of bread and grain now remembered the shadow of blackened flesh and hidden coffins. Travelers returning to the towns recounted rumors of night markets where the unspeakable had been bought and sold. No one verified the stories openly, but everyone knew. The truth was embedded in the air, as palpable as the smell of rain-soaked mud. Historians writing decades later struggled to reconcile the deeds with morality. Church edicts attempted to cleanse the record, but confessions and diaries survived in hidden chapels and behind locked chests. In these scraps, the scale of human corruption, desperation, and the capacity for cruelty under hunger was documented. The Black Feast had transcended simple survival. It had become a reflection of the human soul under pressure. Yet the feast did not vanish with the famine. Humanity's appetite for dominance, for cruelty, for survival at any cost, endured. Children who had witnessed parents consume each other carried trauma into adulthood. Soldiers who had tasted the flesh of the desperate passed on the knowledge, unspoken, through gestures and secret trades. Even kings and priests who had attempted to hide the past were marked by it, their tables, their prayers, their policies forever haunted by the invisible shadow of what had fed them. In literature, the famine became legend. Folk songs transformed horror into caution. Paintings depicted starving figures, skeletal monks, and mothers weeping over empty cradles. The Black Feast was remembered as a moment of human collapse, but also as a warning. Hunger, when allowed to rule unchecked, corrodes the morality and memory of all it touches. In the end, the earth grew green again. Crops returned. Bread once more appeared on tables. Yet beneath the soil, bones remained, and beneath the memory of the living, shame endured. Hunger, in its most insidious form, is not just the gnawing of the belly, but the gnawing of the soul. The Black Feast was never simply a moment in history. It was a mirror, reflecting the darkness that lies dormant in every heart, the hunger for survival, for cruelty, for power. It revealed that the monstrous appetite human beings hide is not only for flesh, but for the domination of life, and that even in the light of renewal, some feasts never truly end. Europe would rebuild, but the shadow of the famine, the memories of the mothers, monks, soldiers, and peasants who had crossed the ultimate threshold, lingered, a silent testament to the truth that the most dangerous hunger is the one that persists long after the table is empty.